very much for coming this morning. I know it's early on Saturday, so I appreciate this. I also want to thank Hanlon for inviting me to this. I'm very excited to be here. I actually did my undergrad at UVic, so it's extra special, and Professor Badesky was one of my teachers in 2000. So being up here, being able to talk with him, I'm a little kind of terrified, but I'm also very, very excited to be here, so thank you. So today I'm going to try to bring two topics together that you know kind of sound like a paradox to begin with, which would be Chinese state-owned enterprises and human rights, and how they're operating abroad. What I'm going to get at today is I'm going to talk about the language that the government's using, and I'm going to try to connect it with the CSR, latest developments of CSR, corporate social responsibility movements domestically, and how they're influencing the kind of international push for China. And just try to kind of look at and explore how this is influencing, how CSR is influencing Chinese foreign policy, and why. What are the implications for the human rights element? So I know human security is a very broad issue. My background has been human rights. I've been working in human rights for the past 6 years. So for me, coming at this angle from a business perspective, it seems kind of only natural, as being in Hong Kong for so long. If you don't incorporate some kind of business element, no one will show up. So this is the beginnings of this research. Sorry. Thanks, Okay, so the background, these are just some general research questions that I was thinking about and that I wanted to answer before I went into this. And the big issue was, and this is part of a larger project, this is part of kind of my doctoral work, and what were the drivers, what are the drivers of corporate social responsibility in China? What is it, why is it all of a sudden being talked about? If you've looked at this at all over there, you could argue that CSR and these issues are, Professor Badesky. Sorry. Yeah, thanks. So it's a booming topic in China. It's a booming topic in Hong Kong. If you show up at any business function, you can't hear language of sustainability not being included these days. So I wanted to kind of look at why this was happening and what were the reasons. And then tie that in more recently. This is the stuff I've been looking at over the last 3 or 4 months. Is how does this tie in? How is this influencing China's international approach to it? Cheers, thanks. And then from there, is China using CSR as kind of an economic grand strategy? Do they have a big strategy for why they're talking about CSR? I'm just going to throw some examples up today on how this is frequently coming up in policy discussions. Again, even at the highest level, we hear Hu Jintao talking at APEC about corporate social responsibility. We hear Wen Jiabao talking at the Davos World Economic Forum about sustainability. So the idea is why is this happening also? And then what influence do human rights have on Chinese state-owned enterprises operating abroad? So the methodology is pretty much a lot on the official policy statements of the government, stuff basically widely available in English, because again they're officially presented as multilateral diplomatic initiatives, as well as 26 semi-structured interviews that were held in these cities. I would also say this research also is kind of gleaned from probably hundreds of conversations I've had over the years in industry-related conferences. The conferences include 2 anti-corruption conferences, one in Singapore, one in Hong Kong, a apparel sector or garment industry sector conference called the Prime Source Forum that was held in Hong Kong. They had an annual meeting in Hong Kong that involves about 400 participants. The business Business Leaders Initiative in Paris in 2008. So I was there, again, talking with companies and how they're approaching this and kind of getting a lot of European perspective with this one, as well as 2 CSR Asia conferences. So CSR Asia is a social enterprise that works on corporate social responsibility issues in the region, based in Hong Kong, and regional offices all over. Okay, so I just want to start with a basic definition of what I'm talking about, because corporate social responsibility is something that is still not really agreed upon on the definition of what it is. This one's pulled from the World Bank. The most important things here are, the only kind of, I could spend all day going through different versions of CSR. The Canadian government has a different version. The Chinese government has a different version. Everyone has a different version. But the 3 main things that come out are kind of in the bubbles, which is economic, social, and environmental. But of course, right, the big issue of CSR is there's got to be a financial return. So we're talking about the sustainability in the middle. So while we're talking about sustainability on environmental and social, right, the CSR will generally not be employed unless there's the economic return. So anyway, so this is kind of the definition I'm working with here. So I want to talk about the drivers. So I've identified 4 drivers of CSR, which in China, which I'm calling CSR engineering, which I'll throw up a chart in a minute. And when I'm talking about CSR engineering, is I'm talking about the literal architecture of social responsibility in China. If you go to meetings and look at who's talking about social responsibility, it's not your average consumer. It's not your grassroots NGO. It's high level. It's international NGOs. It's government. It's CEOs. It's chambers of commerce. It's a very exclusive group. And so when you're looking at policies, if you go on the internet and you look at corporate CSR statements and stuff, these are very strategically designed and done in collaboration with public relations firms and communication firms. So it's a very engineered process is one of the things I'm arguing. And so the 4 drivers that are mainly responsible for this in China, from what I've found, what I would argue, is the most important one being government in the mainland. And this is essentially on the 2 sides. From foreign governments and domestic, there's a demand for responsible products. And CSR is in China works in a way to provide kind of independent regulatory regulatory supervision without having to enforce it. Because as we probably, many of you know, the regulatory enforcement mechanisms in China aren't the greatest. So CSR being promoted by the government is a means to kind of empower companies to do it for them. Now there's a cost there, where the cost is passed over to the company. But the issue is the government benefits on the side of reputational. They don't have to worry about companies coming in and throwing their brands through the brand name through the rubbish. On vice versa, foreign governments don't have to worry about their national brands in China acting irresponsibly. So there's a definite government push. So protecting national brands, I've just put Siemens and Lucent up there. We can go into the examples during the discussion, but Siemens and Lucent, I'm talking about the 2 major corruption cases, the 2 biggest ones that have come out over the last few years. Siemens was recently fined $1.6 billion for bribery. Major, global bribery by the U.S. Regulatory bodies, but many of those bribes were paid in China. Lucent is kind of now the poster child for bribery as well. This case is still going through the processes, but the issue is when these companies get hit, there is a reflection on the government, the countries that these come from. And then the next example where you have Rio Tinto and Mattel, right? When we look at these companies as not acting responsibly, if you will, it's very easy to blame the Chinese government for saying there's lead paint in Mattel toys. But as you know, Mattel was clearly not doing their due diligence in their supply chain. So there's a very strong interest in pointing out to Mattel that you're not managing your own business. But the Rio Tinto case is interesting. If you follow this one, this was more in the bribery case in Shanghai, where Rio Tinto executive was caught paying money to a state-owned enterprise, linked state-owned enterprise. And if you follow the media reports, right, the Rio Tinto thing kind of came into the second or third paragraph of any media report. The first two were always the official Australian government reaction, the official Chinese government reaction, and it became a very diplomatic issue. Even though you have a publicly listed firm, independently bribing, right? It was an independent act of bribery, and Rio Tinto immediately just separated themselves from that executive. But the issue still became at the state level. So there was a clear interest in Australia having their firms not engage in bribery abroad. I'm just going to move down. The history of China in CSR has been around for a long time. We'll talk about that in a second. But the two things here is under Deng Xiaoping, there was something that emerged called the glorious cause, and this was kind of reference to the opening up of new business practice, the way business should be behaving ethically. This emerged in the early 90s, and more recently we have something called harmonious society, and this is clearly stated in 2005 in a very public policy statement by Hu Jintao that directed state-owned enterprises to behave in a certain way, ethically, responsibly. They used the language of the scientific nature of corporate social responsibility, but it was a clear direction. Now, it's also important to know that state-owned enterprises are different than private businesses in China. This directive of harmonious society was to specifically to state-owned enterprises on the right. So, and how's business responding to this? Well, we have a history in China that the Confucian businessman. This kind of term has also emerged again recently, and it's more or less of a view that business responds. You practice business, but you don't lose your Confucian values to give back to society and such and such. But as many people have argued, the modern version of CSR didn't really emerge until the 20th century, and it's been a predominantly Western push into China. It's been Western business ethics, it's been Western modes of doing business, and this kind of emerged at the end of the last century, last century. But businesses responded, and they're taking it seriously. I dare you to find any multinational corporation that's working in China that isn't talking about social responsibility. And the reason is because of quality control and risk management. Right? There's major risk if they're not involved in managing their social and environmental consequences. And that's largely due because of, there's domestic lobbies on this side of the world where you have people pressuring companies to act responsibly. But, how does that translate into China? We'll talk about it in a second. The point is that it's being pushed, everyone's talking about it, and it is really booming. Intergovernmental organizations play a major role in CSR in China. They're facilitating dialogue regularly. The latest one, the most recent one, is that Germany's GTZ, the development agency, has a 4-year contract with the government to advise them on CSR issues. We have many examples of the Asian Development Bank and the IFC and the UN facilitating stakeholder engagements, bringing people together, talking to the government. You're familiar with the Whistler China Business Forum if you come across them. They're a Canadian initiative that's been in China just in September to do a stakeholder engagement. They're trying to do China and Canada CSR initiatives, but it's at the policy level. So they go to Shanghai and invite everyone from CELAC to come and kind of explain what's happening, and they exchange knowledge on financial institutions and all kinds of stuff. But the other issue is intergovernmental organizations have been key in pushing kind of labor issues and child rights. As much as we complain about China's labor standards, and we do know that there's child labor, and we do know there is endemic labor violations. They have signed on to many of these agreements. Of course, the enforcement is a different issue, but the language is being talked about. Non-governmental organizations, right, as we know, in China, are generally very weak. They lack independence. However, this is important. It's excluding NGOs and IGOs in Hong Kong and international organizations that are pushing. So if you were to go to Hong Kong and talk to these international organizations that are based there, they have major campaigns in pressuring companies that are operating in the mainland. And a lot of them have their Asia-Pacific headquarters in Hong Kong. But of course, CSR can be a source of funding for NGOs, so they're very, they're very happy to talk to business about these things. There's a sense of free riding, right? Your NGO brand can get a lot of publicity if you're beside a company. But NGOs can also act as this kind of independent auditor and monitor. And this is a debate happening now in Hong Kong, I would argue, about do these NGOs go into China and monitor supply chains? Do they go in there? Because they do lose a sense of their independence, right? If they're contracted by a company to go do these things. So this debate's still happening. And then of course there's competing CSR interests between NGOs. So the stuff that I look at on human rights is always pushed right out of the agenda, right? Because in Hong Kong and in China you don't want to talk about these things, but the environmental factor is kind of pushed right up, right? So again, I know I've said this in other talks, but I've been in meetings where the human rights issue was just basically just totally ignored, and business can respond and say, no, we are socially responsible because we're talking about environments. See, these are our NGO partners because we're dealing with Greenpeace, so we're ethical. But they're not talking to any of the other NGOs, so they can kind of manage their. And so it looks like they're engaging civil society, but they're very strategically engaging only a part of civil society that they're choosing to engage. So basically, this is what I'm arguing it looks like. Is the CSR engineering, and I should say something on the consumer because of course the consumers do play a role, but I'm arguing in this sense they don't play a role in the nature of CSR policy, because again, if you were to go into the rooms, you have very special interest groups kind of negotiating what the social responsibility of business in China looks like. And so you have expert advisors advising all sides, and then you have these guys coming together and then negotiating. And of course, the power bases in this model are different, right? I would argue government is much larger, right, and NGOs are much smaller. So it would look different if I were to put up the based on who has influence in this model. But I'm just going to get into China growth and trade. I think we're all in agreement. China's growth is immense. The overseas exploration of resources, has been called unstoppable. It's been called it's not going to end. This is just one of hundreds of charts that show this, in China's demand for resources. What I'm trying to show here, though, is there's, the connection between the ability to deliver resources and the legitimacy of the government, right? So there's a clear domestic desire to bring the resources into the country. Of course, if they can't bring the resources in, they're going to have major legitimacy problems as a party. So there's a high political cost or push to get resources. And one of the things I'm arguing in this is this is pushing China to embrace neoliberal economic institutions on all levels. And because they realize if they do not engage this, right, they will lose the domestic credibility. So this is just one example. 75% of China's oil is expected to be imported. I realize there's many energy experts here, so I'm not going to pretend I know about the energy stuff. But and I know oil is only a small portion of your energy strategy. But the idea is that they are abroad and they're looking for resources. And this is right out of the Chinese government's official policy. It is driving us into conflict zones. Right in June this summer in New York, right, we had the Chinese delegation clearly said at the United Nations Global Compact, which is the kind of major UN CSR body, saying that we are being driven into conflict zones, and we realize it, and we have to mitigate that risk. But it's talked about in an economic sense. It's not talked, and this is what I want to talk about, the human security issue. Because as we know, right, state-owned enterprises and human rights don't have kind of the best reputation. There are countless anecdotal examples of this happening in all parts of the world. Depending on where you talk about. One of my friends or colleagues who's looking at this in Cambridge, he had this. He was just in Africa, and the kind of fifth point, or sorry, South America, the fifth point, where he was getting in his interview fieldwork. He was saying, in South America, the Chinese are regarded as these are Chinese colonies emerging in the natural resource sector. So say what you will. There's a there's definitely, cooperation on the government level, on elites, right? You have the Chinese government, and then you have elites in developing emerging economies working together. On paper, it looks very smooth, and it looks very beneficial, development, blah, blah, blah. But on the ground, right, major problems, right? You're getting, the Chinese are getting hit again and again with protests, violent protests, labor disruptions, and it's happening again and again. And one of the things I'm arguing is this is making state-owned enterprises and the Chinese government not necessarily, and this is important, they're not necessarily, implementing CSR, but they're using the language of CSR to kind of push that we are responsible overseas. Because if they know if they want to come into other countries, they're going to have to do it. I'm not going to kind of go read all these, but these are just kind of some, I just got 5 official policy documents that have come up recently, right? This is the China-Africa Business Council. This was a kind of paper that was pulled off the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at a conference, and it had, in conclusion, the China-Africa Business Council, we agree that CSR and corporate social responsibility is important to development, right? And then the last line of this statement, to the numerous developing countries, the rights of subsistence and development are actually the human rights of utmost importance. So there's still kind of this pushback, to development. The human right of development is the most important issue. But they're talking about the language of CSR. So I don't want to go as far as saying it's smoke and mirrors, but like any company and any government, it's not just China, I would say. But the issue is that they're talking about human rights and development in a CSR language framework. This is a statement pulled off, a recent permanent mission to the government to the United Nations. Right? China attaches great importance to the role of partnerships playing development and favors entering into partnerships with the private sector. At the international level, the Chinese government is actively developing multilateral and bilateral cooperation from international partners, blah, 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 with the private sector. So again, these are statements, official statements saying we're going to be, engaging these things. Here we have, the state assets organization, again, fulfilling CSR is the need, participate in international economic cooperation as progress for economic globalization. The international community concerns more and more on the performance and the enterprise's social responsibility. Again, another official statement. Here you have the Asia-Europe meeting, right? You have many European governments. If you look at Norway, you look at France, they have CSR ambassadors, officially appointed ministers, similar to kind of Canada's CSR counselor. And they're going to China on a regular basis, talking at the highest policy level on social responsibility of business. So this is kind of Article 36 of the Declaration that was signed in Beijing in 2008. Again, we undertake social responsibility, complying, and so. And this is recently, in June, this summer, right? President of China's Enterprise Confederation, who's also, of course, the vice chairman of the 10th People's Congress, said business has a duty to respect employees, society, consumer, and other stakeholders, and shoulder the responsibility for sustainable development. So, again, you're getting official statements talking about this. Again and again, it's increasing. And one of the things is why is this happening, right? Are they really, is there really a push? And I kind of outlined 3 reasons why this is happening. And the first being reputational defense. Of course, China is rising as trying to project itself as a responsible power, right? And investment in one country where they might, the government and the investors are very good at kind of amending their policy to country-specific issues. So if if they're investing in say Sudan, and then they want to come into Canada, they have to amend their policy. They have to learn about how to do business ethically in different countries. But the idea is, again, the reputation of being a responsible power, right? Having the name dragged through, not all the time, does have an influence on policy leaders, I would argue. But not to say an influence to do something meaningful, but an influence to incorporate language to try to change that image. The second thing is competitiveness. And if you look at the issue, again, China needs to legitimize its domestic political, and it has had to engage neoliberal institutions. And neoliberal institutions, including all these ones right here, are actively talking about corporate social responsibility. Now, why? And I would argue China is the reason why they're talking about it, because they can't compete with Chinese bids in some countries these days. In the past, if major bids for, especially in Africa, would be going to the World Bank and the IFC. The Chinese are outbidding the World Bank and the IFC for the first time. So this is a major problem for neoliberal institutions. So the idea is, well, how do we make sure that we can compete against these Chinese firms that keep undercutting us? Because they're undercutting us because they're avoiding environmental standards, they're avoiding labor standards. We know they use prison labor in many of their countries, so you can get bottom dollar for stuff like that. So the idea is to bring in social responsibility. So by pushing social responsibility, you have to bring the Chinese up, and it will make this idea that we're going to push competitiveness, best practice, right? It's a way to kind of bring the Chinese investment organizations into a zone that the World Bank can compete again. And I think the Chinese, they know this, so, and they have to play this game. So it's one of the reasons why they're engaged. And then of course the other reason why they could possibly be doing this is it is a risk management issue. It is best practice. Corporate social responsibility is very aligned with contemporary business ideology. The very famous old statement that the business of business is business. The Milton Friedman kind of stuff that only profit matters. You still that worldview of profit making is getting smaller and smaller. You'd be very hard pressed to find any business school that's not talking about sustainability, business ethics. So it is in line with best practice. It is in line with financial return. And we do know, right, if you can manage your supply chain effectively, if you don't have lead paint, if you don't have chemicals in your products, and you're getting your name dragged through the mud, you will have a chance to make more profit. So there is a significant return in risk management. And so in conclusion, what does this mean and for human security and the human rights issues and the environmental stuff? I think, and what I'm arguing is China's approach of using the language, the CSR, to address human security issues is entirely economic. So it is not at all to do with human security, it is to do with profit making and keep stability in domestic policies.
Okay. Thank you so much.